Looks like everyone from the waiting room is in, and then anyone else can jump in as we go. So welcome everyone. Thanks for being here. We are here with America Outdoors today to talk about the Explore Act. We have been celebrating it. We have been talking about this for more than a decade. These guys have been working on it for more than a decade. So it's time to talk about those bits and pieces and the nitty-gritty and what it means for your business. So, before we start, I want to just kind of kick off with a thank you. I see a lot of you in this session, and a lot of you signed up our America Outdoors members. We have huge gratitude for that. Your membership is the reason that we can do this work. Your membership is the reason we're here and the reason we're getting this legislation for your business and the reason we can put out resources like this webinar. So thank you. If you are not a member, we would love to see you join. We would love to see you support us. We have a few other things upcoming. Just to kind of touch base, Managers Academy is a 2-day online course that is coming up April 15th and 16th. We have professionals that are coming to teach those 2 days of classes, and they are interactive sessions to really up the game in management for your outfit. So if you have anyone that's new or newer, or if you just want to sharpen those skills, please sign up for that. That same week on the 17th, on that Thursday, we have a webinar with CBiz Adventure Sports. That's insurance. They're going to be following up from our conference in Chattanooga, trying to answer and help support some of those new insurance questions that you have. And then we also have a fundraising trip. So being a nonprofit, working for your industries, we are always looking for some cash flow. This is an amazing opportunity to get outside with your peers, to network, and to raise money for America Outdoors. We are going to the Grand Canyon. This is sponsored by Hatch River Expeditions. So they will be doing all of the hard work. You just need to sign up, make that donation, show up, and have an amazing time with your peers. That is coming up. That is the last week of August, the 21st through the 27th. So please check that out. We have 27 seats. I have just a handful of them left, and we'd love to fill it up with everybody. So check that out. Sign up. I will put a link to our events in the chat so you can see all those things, but get involved so we can continue this work. Please be a member. Think about sponsorships, donations, coming to conference, and then joining some of these events we're putting on. That being said, thank you all for being here. These guys have a lot to talk about with the Explore Act, so I will introduce you our Executive Director, Aaron Bannon, Jonathan Simon, Van Ness Feldman, and David Brown from the Bennett Group. And like I said before, these guys have a good decade worth of work on this bill, which is now law. So they're going to help you try to get started implementing that. And we have a long session. There's a lot to get to. So if you have questions during this webinar, please type them in the Q&A. I am going to follow up on them. I don't think we will have time to get to them today, but if you have specific questions, please put them in there and we'll get back to you. Good? Aaron, I'm going to turn it over. Thank you all.
Thank you very much, Karen. And thank you very much, David and John, for joining us here today. There's a long history of this bill that I'll be able to get into a little bit. These guys have been here for the long haul, so we have great perspective on the bill, great understanding of the intent of a lot of the provisions, and excited to share this with you. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. We will try to be efficient. If we can get to 1 or 2 questions, I think that would be beneficial. And we might have maybe 5 or 10 minutes at the end of this to be able to do that. So with luck, we can answer some of your questions. Let me go ahead and start our show. And so we're going to be doing this in 3 parts. I'll go ahead and cover a little bit of the short history of the Explore Act, and then I'm going to turn it over to David Brown. David's going to do an overview of SOAR Act, of Title III of the Greater Explore Act, primarily focused on permitting provisions. And then John Simon's going to take some time to talk about additional provisions that are relevant in the Explore Act to you and your operation. Um, and that's sort of the layout of it. So we'll dive right in. Um, a short history of Explore. There have been a lot of different versions of this bill over the years. And the earliest iteration would be the Federal Lands Recreation Enhancement Act that passed in 2004. That bill was set to last for 10 years. And since 2014, it's been extended year by year. But as we started to work on renewing that act, we were looking at some provisions we'd want to change for Outfitters and Guides Act. And so in the 113th Congress in 2014, we worked with Congressman Bishop to introduce FLORIMA, Federal Lands Recreation Modernization Act, which renewed FLORIA and had a number of provisions that we were looking for guides and outfitters. And that was really sort of the stake in the sand that we had as we were going forth. After the 113th, we opted to break that bill out and call it the Guides and Outfitters Act. And the Guides and Outfitters Act carried forward for quite a while, introduced by Representative LaMalfa. He reintroduced it in the 115th. He then, notably, it passed the House in the 115th. He reintroduced it into the 116th, and then it was incorporated into the SOAR Act later in the 116th. So several different introductions of all these bills that were eventually incorporated into the package. It is America's Outdoor Recreation Act. That was introduced in 2021 in the 117th. And AORA, as it was colloquially called, was picked up by the House, converted into the Explore Act, and more provisions were added to this. And that bill was enacted in January 4th of this year after it passed the House in December 19th. I think it was, I hope that number is right, but December 19th. We would not pass. So a couple things about Federal Lands Recreation Enhancement Act and why it's significant to us today. It was actually based off of a concept called fee demo, a bill that had been put into place in the early 2000s, I think 2002. And the concept behind fee demo was to keep the fees, the amenity fees and the fees that you commercial outfitters pay on site, so that 80% of those fees could be used to pay for various efforts on that particular site. So as you can see this list here, repair and maintenance of facilities, interpretation and visitor information, habitat restoration, law enforcement, direct operating or capital costs associated with fee recreation, and the fee management agreement. All that carried through to the eventual passage of FLORIA. And was included in all this bill. And a couple other things that are in FLORIA as well that don't impact us as much. The America the Beautiful Pass, which was established and continues to be relevant there, and established recreation resource advisory councils to process fee changes. Colloquially called rec racks. Most states have a rec rack set up. They function to various degrees of success, but any fee change that happens on federal lands goes through those recreation resource advisory councils from FLORIA. There's two more provisions that are on the end of this that I didn't include in my original list because those are part of the new Explore Act provisions. That's the processing of special recreation permit applications and the administration of special recreation improvements and the improvement of the operation of the special recreation permit program. So those are two new things that your fees can be used for through the Explore Act. David will get into that in a little bit more detail, but that was something that we got and added to FLORIA. So looking at the Guides and Outfitters Act, which came out of FLORIMA, as I said, it was fairly, I would say, consolidated and direct in how it targeted the Forest Service primarily, and in some cases the Bureau of Land Management, and tried to do some things that we needed that had fallen away when the Forest Service put together their new permitting policy in 2007, 2008. We asked to restore U.S. Forest Service temporary permits. We asked that similar uses be allowed to be included in permits. We tried to relax some overly aggressive and some might say punitive use reviews that happen every 5 years on Forest Service permits. We tried to relax limitations on permit growth, and we tried to assure that fees and other costs remained under control for outfitters. 3% or equivalent flat fee of gross revenues, some limitations on cost recovery that were pretty critical, and ultimately limitations on some items included in your gross revenue calculation. So all those have been in the Guides and Outfitters Act for a while. They eventually got incorporated into the SOAR Act, which was introduced in the same Congress as the GO Act, but at a later date by Senator Marty Heinrich. And the SOAR Act took what we wanted out of the GO Act, added provisions that a number of other new stakeholders coming out of the Outdoor Access Working Group. It was headed up by RAI and the Outdoor Industry Association. Well, a number of those provisions eventually became incorporated through extended negotiation, and we ended up with a broader bill called the SOAR Act. The SOAR Act incorporates more agencies, including Fish and Wildlife Service and the Army Corps of Engineers. It incorporates the Park Service in specific provisions. David will talk a little bit about that too. And in some of our negotiations, some of the things that the Outdoor Access Working Group really wanted was provisions for multi-jurisdictional permits, application process requirements and timing responses so that they got information back from agencies in a timely fashion. And for like school groups that are unable to indemnify the federal government because they're considered state entities, they have an indemnification exemption. And of course, there's a state exculpatory agreement allowance in there too. The SOAR Act was incorporated into America's Outdoor Recreation Act, became a broader Senate package. And I would say that was a bit of a line in the sand for this group. As the Senate reworked its America's Outdoor Recreation Act, we noted just a complete overhaul of all the SOAR Act provisions that were done in a way that we could no longer support. And they were trying to move this bill very fast. So we had about 2 weeks to be able to bring this bill back from the brink. It took longer than 2 weeks. We had to stall the bill so that we could address the numerous changes that we needed to see in there. And it was actually a remarkable time where David and John and I sat down with the Senate ENR, Democrat and Republican staff rewriting this bill, and we went through the whole bill provision by provision until we could get something that we could live with. It still was based off of the Senate language. So conceptually, I would say the bill definitely became more complex and a little more complicated to interpret clearly, but definitely still a net benefit for outfitters in the end. So we're very happy with the package. And we probably could have got that done in the 117th, but we stalled out because of lack of time in the House calendar to reconsider. I'm sorry. We could have got more changes done through the Senate actually in the 118th, but we ran out of time in that Senate calendar too. Oh, I'm conflating America's Outdoor Recreation Act with the Explore Act. I apologize. America's Outdoor Recreation Act almost got passed in the 117th. Congressman Westerman insisted on regular order, that he wanted his committee to fully consider the bill. And so there was no time to pull that off at the end of the Congress. So they took it up at the beginning of the 118th, where the House considered the Senate package, reimagined it, called it the Explore Act, added more provisions, which John Simon will be able to get into a little bit, and created something more or less with what we have today. It is a complex bill with numerous reports, studies, and pilot programs. And if it had gone through as is, we were very concerned it was going to saddle permit administrators. The bill is supposed to be enabling to process permits to fulfill all of these obligations. So we pushed for provision that requires specific funds to be allocated for these programs if they require additional allocation or they aren't considered implemented. So that makes this big recreation package consumable ultimately, and consumable to everybody. Passed by unanimous consent on the Senate floor on December 27th of 2024. And notably, it extended the entire Federal Land Recreation Enhancement Act, of which much of these provisions are amendments to, through September 30th, 2020, 2031. And that's my story. With that, happy to, as we said, answer questions about that. But there was a long process that got us to the bill that we have today. And Title III of the Explore Act is, in fact, the Simplifying Access for Outdoor Recreation Act, which is where I hand this over to David. Hey, David.
Well, thank you, Aaron. As Aaron said, the SOARS is the acronym for Simplifying Access for Outdoor Recreation. Now, this bill has a lot of benefits for outfitters, but I don't think it really necessarily simplifies access because it's a fairly complex bill. And one of the concerns we have, there's some aspects of it that may be difficult for the agencies to implement in a short term. Most of the outfittering guide stuff should not be a problem, however. It does amend the Federal Lands Recreation Enhancement Act and authorizes outfittering guide permits and fees for Forest Service, BLM, Bureau of Reclamation, and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. It sunsets in 2031. This bill authorizes many types of activities, recreation activities on public lands, organizational camp permits, single event permits, permits where the public is allocated. In some rivers, both the public and the commercial sector are allocated. So it authorizes permits in those circumstances, permits for large groups of 75 or more, competitive events, recurring organized groups, which is kind of a new category for less than 7 participants. And then, of course, the ones that are important to you are highlighted: recurring outfittering guide permits for 10 years or less, and a temporary permit, which in the past, some of the agencies have had temporary permits. The Forest Service has a modified temporary permit now, but this one has no restrictions on the number of service days. One important exclusion is this bill does not cover NPS contracts or park special use permits. It does have a few provisions that apply to CUAs, commercial use authorizations, but in general, the authority for those permits and contracts is still the Concessions Management Improvement Act of 1998. There's some key definitions here. I'm not going to go into the details on all of them, but one that's very important to you is the definition of visitor use days, which means that a visitor use days can be a user day, a launch, or any other metric used for authorizing use. And the reason that's important is that in some cases, for example, on the Middle Fork of the Salmon, the management plan specifies that you're allocated by launches. And so when they do use reviews, they use launch instead of user days to determine your reassignment of use. There are also multidisciplinary trips or permits authorized for multi-jurisdictional trips in this bill, which is a very important pilot program that's authorized. The bill also is the authority for recreation permit fees. It's interesting that it says the secretary may charge a special recreation permit fee for the issuance of special recreation permits. There's some actually a caveat that allows permits to be issued without fees, but in most cases, I think you can assume you're going to be paying the fees that are authorized in this legislation. There are 2 important fees for outfitters. One, there's the authorization of a flat fee. Prior to 2008, the Forest Service had a flat fee authority, but they limited that in 2008 to only temporary permits for 200 service days or less. This authorizes a flat fee, which in the bill is called a predetermined fee, which can be based on on visitor use days. They can actually give you a fee for the entire permit, just a flat fee for like $1,000 for a permit for a specified amount of use. The other important element of this is the it authorizes 3% of adjusted gross receipts, which it specifies 3%, which means that in order to change that fee, legislation will be required. The flat fee authority is unique in the sense that when I said there were no flat fees authorized outside of the temporary permits in 2008, one exception was Alaska. Alaska had a flat fee authority that existed since the late 90s. That will stay in place, as well as any other flat fees that were authorized prior to enactment of this bill. Then there's a 2-year window when the agencies can establish flat fees. So if you're interested in flat fees for your use, you'll probably want to try to get it done within 2 years. After that period, the flat fee goes to $6 per visitor use day, which is not something we advocated for. That's just something the Legislative Council and the authors of the bill came up with. The one of the keys for the flat fee I also mentioned was that the $6 charge, again, that doesn't is not initiated until 2 years after the date of enactment. Now, if you have flat fees established before then, those flat fees will be the fees that you pay. But if any fees are established after that 2-year period, it will be $6. One of the other important provisions of the bill is it allows the service provider to inform the customer of the fees charged by the agencies for the permitted activities. And some forests would not allow that in the past. It also allows the fees to be used to fund visitor reservation services, the processing of permit applications, and administration, and improving or streamlining the recreation permit program. The permit process improvements include a couple of very important provisions. One, to reduce the cost of issuing special recreation permits, to decrease the processing times, to use simplified permits for certain groups, of course. But the key thing for you will be the evaluation of additional categorical exclusions. And that's part of the NEPA process that's required when the agency makes a major decision, such as issuing a permit. A categorical exclusion allows them to avoid a higher level of NEPA, which is very important if you're on the hook for paying for those processes through cost recovery. Another important provision is the elimination of a needs assessment outside of wilderness. The agencies had, especially the Forest Service now, not so much BLM, but the Forest Service had implemented needs assessments to issue new types of permits for new activities. And those assessments really had no organized or policy direction of significance. The forest used very different processes, and they were not I think, well done in most cases. But this eliminates that requirement. You're still going to have a needs assessment prior to issuing a permit in wilderness. The bill also authorizes online permit applications within 3 years and for either new or reissued permits. And they do have a provision that allows submission by mail or in person. I'm not going to get into the details on the other types of uses that are authorized, but there are specific types of recreation groups identified in the bill, like youth groups, and that's defined as anyone under the age of 25. There's also a nominal effects determination process that has existed in the Forest Service that essentially says if some group, it usually is for non-recurring uses, but wants to do an activity and the impacts are nominal, they won't have to have a permit. If they may have more than nominal effects, then the Forest Service can issue them a permit. So that the agency may also waive fees for these organized groups activities, including youth group activities. So those are, won't get into the weeds on this, but most of the time this is going to apply to those groups that are activity groups that are for non-reoccurring uses or certainly minimal types of activities. Another very important provision is that allows a permit holder. Now, this is for outfitters and guides, but it could apply to other groups too. But it mostly will apply to the outfit and guide permits to engage in substantially similar recreation activities if they're comparable in type, nature, and scope to authorized activities and provide no greater impact or adverse effect on other permit holders. A good example of this would be if you're authorized to rent canoes and kayaks and you want to also rent paddle boards. In the past, in some cases, the Forest Service, for example, told one outfitter they had to do a NEPA evaluation. Well, this prohibits or eliminates that requirement and allows the agency the flexibility to include that type of use under the existing authorization. Next slide. One of the other provisions allows for the, or requires actually the agency to notify potential permit holders or applicants, I would say, of the availability of new permits, either through a website or email notification system. This doesn't apply to the reissuance of existing permits or to permits issued to the buyer of a business, but this would be for permits for new activities. It also requires the acknowledgement of a receipt of an application and the notification of when a final decision, projected date for a final decision. And of course, this doesn't apply to NPS concession contracts. The bill authorizes one permit for multi-jurisdictional trips as a pilot program. Within 2 years of enactment, the agencies are expected to have a pilot program for these multi-jurisdictional trips. Ultimately, the pilot program will include at least 10 multi-jurisdictional permits within 4 years. And also, this is one of the provisions that applies to NPS CUAs. In other words, if you have a trip that goes between BLM and the Forest Service and then into a national park under a CUA, that could be included under the multi-jurisdictional permit. There will be a lead agency issuing that permit. The temporary permit authorization will be for up to 2 years. And one important component of this is that it allows for conversion of a temporary permit to a long-term permit after 2 years of satisfactory performance. Now, because this isn't limited to a specific number of user days, like 200 service days, it kind of reestablishes what had been occurring for some previously in the Forest Service, especially before 2008, where they would issue temporary permits and without doing the significant NEPA evaluation, because there's a categorical exclusion for temporary permits for 1 year or less. Now, there's not one for 2 years at this time, but that's one of the things we would be advocating for them to consider. Use reviews for long-term permits. If you're in the you operate in the national forest, you understand what this is. This bill also authorizes use reviews for BLM, but it doesn't require it. It says they may do these use reviews. However, the Forest Service is required to do use reviews. It's actually more favorable than the current use review mandate, which was established in regulation. If you turn your use, if, for example, you surrender visitor use days within a specific time, you get a half-day user credit for, as if essentially you used it for or you get credit for half a use day. Not sure how that's going to work for launches. That's something that will have to be figured out. But if in the event where beyond circumstances beyond your control, you're unable to use, you'll get a full credit for the use day. And next slide. So, and then when they determine, your how much capacity you've used, subject to that half-day credit, you get 125% of assigned use up to your original allocation. As you know, prior to the enactment of this legislation, if you had more than 1,000 use days assigned to your permit, you only got 115% of actual use. So this is much more favorable. Now, if you're unsatisfactory, you only get, and after that use review, you only get actual use. And surrendered capacity may be temporarily reassigned to existing or potential permit holders or to organized groups that are identified in one of the provisions in this legislation. Oh, and one other very important thing, this bill authorizes the agencies to assign additional capacity to permit holders if there's an additional allocated capacity available. The liability provision is another very important provision. It does establish insurance requirements. There's some interesting provisions here that were not necessarily something we advocated, but one of the provisions says they shall not require, and it says shall not require insurance for permits for low risk commercial uses. And it's hard to know what they anticipate low risk commercial uses to be. So I'm not quite sure how that's going to be defined, but that will be one of the rules, obviously, as the regulations rules roll out to enact this legislation. It does eliminate the indemnification requirements for certain government entities, such as college and universities, where they were prohibited from indemnifying the government. So that had been a sticking point for those groups. The other very important provision that will certainly be of benefit to most outfitters or many outfitters in the National Forest is it prohibits, and CUA holders, and actually CUA and contract holders in national parks, is it prohibits the implementation of enforcement of any regulation or guidance that eliminates the use of exculpatory agreements, which are waivers, by recreation service providers and CUA holders. Now, the Park Service recently extended that to concessions contracts as well. There is a cost recovery provision in here. It got watered down from what we had opposed originally in the GO Act. It does allow a de minimis exemption from cost recovery for each permit if the agencies establish cost recovery on an hourly basis. In some cases, for example, the Forest Service cost recovery has a flat fee amount for submission of an application for a permit. So it wouldn't apply in those cases. But if they do a master cost recovery agreement for a group of permits and they base that on an hourly rate, then the agencies can implement an exemption for a specific number of hours or times. It prohibits cost recovery for programmatic environmentalist reviews, and the bill also promotes the use of programmatic environmental reviews. And that's a case where and when they're doing a management plan, they will do a lot of the NEPA documentation in the management plan for a specific type of use, commercial use or otherwise. And so that you don't have to pay for all the site-specific NEPA documentation that would normally be required or might be required if they had not done it previously. And that's it, I think, for my presentation. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, David, for that walkthrough. It's like to see it all in one place. It really sort of sinks in like how much is really going to change because of this bill. I just had a couple of thoughts, and I want to make sure I get this right. I was thinking about the flat fee of $6 or the 3% provision. I just wanted to point out to folks that if your agency embarks on a fee change, and they're going through that 2 years, at the end of that 2 years, it's either going to be like hopefully they pick a flat fee before that 2 years is up. But if they haven't picked a fee at the end of that 2-year deadline, you as an operator get to choose whether you want to go with $6 or you want to go with 3%. So the power is in your hands to decide what that's going to be. And also, I was just thinking about that. Like the permitted low risk use, the uninsured low risk use. We are concerned about that provision because the inevitable eventual outcome will be legally complicated. But no agency is required to issue that permit. So it is a may issue in front of that one. But if they take that may, then they have to take the other shall to allow it to be an uninsured trip. So they don't have to initiate the process in the first place, is what I'm saying, if they go down that path. And so I'll leave it there. I just had like those couple of add-ons, and I hope I interpreted that right. But John Simon, who's up next, will certainly correct me if I'm wrong. And I don't know if you have anything to tag on to David's Explore Act, the very thorough SOAR Act explanation. But if you do, that's great. Otherwise, I'd love to get into these additional Explore Act provisions that you prepared for us, John.
Yep. Thanks, Aaron. Yeah, I think David did a great job. I'm just going to move on from there. So the SOAR Act is just one piece, and a big piece, certainly, of the 85 or so page Explore Act. And so I'm going to speak to some of the other provisions in the Act that may be of interest. And so generally, the Explore Act declares that it's the policy of the federal government to foster and encourage recreation on federal recreational lands and waters. And the bill includes a range of provisions, in addition to the SOAR Act provisions, which do that as well, to carry out that policy. And so in the interest of time, I'm going to do a pretty high-level run-through of at least some of them that we thought would be of interest. So the bill directs, or the Act directs the Secretary of the Interior to complete and maintain an inventory and assessment of recreation resources on federal recreational lands and waters. And that includes looking at opportunities to develop, expand, or enhance those resources. In addition to that, along the same theme of expanding access, there are provisions in the bill to extend seasonal recreational opportunities, and it requires, and in that front, many of you, obviously, or most of you probably operate seasonal opportunities or seasonal activities. And so the bill requires the land management agencies to work with outdoor recreation businesses operating on or adjacent to federal lands, or with local governments and others, to better understand visitation trends, the effects of or impacts of seasonal closures, as well as look for opportunities to expand seasons. And there are some other provisions along those lines too, but that's something that may be of interest to some of you, because there are certainly some places where operations are closed down maybe earlier than they need to be, and so wanted to make you aware of that. Bill calls on agencies to identify existing long-distance bike trails and opportunities to develop or complete new ones. Includes a number of provisions to improve access for people with disabilities. On that front, it directs an accessible recreation inventory to determine the accessibility of existing outdoor recreation facilities, as well as identify opportunities to better disseminate information about those facilities to the public. It also calls for a detailed trail inventory of high priority trails. There are a number of provisions that, not as many as in some of the earlier iterations of the legislation, but there are a number of provisions that are call for pretty resource intensive surveys and studies. This is probably one of them, although it's a little narrower than it had been. And there are also pilot programs to improve existing and develop new accessible trails and recreation opportunities. And so recreation opportunities could include things like camping, snow activities, water activities, climbing, biking, ORVs, picnic facilities, and others. The Act includes provisions to promote outdoor recreation for military service members and veterans, and also calls for the Secretaries of Interior and Agriculture to develop a new strategy to increase youth visits. And along with that, it extends the popular Every Kid Outdoors program, which many of you may know, provides a free access pass to parks and other federal lands to fourth graders and their families, and extends that program until out to September 30th, 2031. So next, thanks, Aaron. So some of you may be interested in some of the changes to the requirements around filming and still photography in units of the park system and on other federal lands. And these changes reduce the permitting requirements in some cases, particularly for smaller groups. But there are separate sections in the Act for both the Park Service, and so there's one section that addresses Park Service. There's another section that addresses federal lands. Generally, the requirements are similar, but it is important that if this is something that's of interest to you, that you consult specific agency requirements, not just with regard to the language that's in the bill, but in terms of whatever guidance that the individual agencies have put out or will be putting out. So under these new requirements, generally no permit is required anymore where there are fewer than 6 people involved, and specified requirements are met with regard to the location of the filming or photography and avoidance of impacts on other visitors and resources. And no permits also generally, permits generally also not required where the filming or photography is either incidental to or documenting an allowed or authorized activity or event, regardless of the number of people involved and regardless of whether there's any compensation involved to anyone in connection with that activity. The second category is a de minimis youth authorization with no fee, and that's where there are between 6 and 8 people involved. And again, those same requirements are met with regard to where the location of the activity and avoiding impacts on other visitors and resources. And then if none of those apply, then the agency can require a permit and assess a reasonable fee where more than 8 people are involved or those specified requirements are not met. So beneficial for some folks. Again, if it's something that concerns you, highly advise checking to see what the specific agency requirements are and guidance. Next slide, Aaron. So just wanted to hit 3 other unrelated provisions. One is the Explore Act includes provisions to kind of beef up and strengthen the what's called FICOR, the Federal Interagency Council on Outdoor Recreation. And for those not familiar with it, FICOR is an interagency council of the land management agencies and other federal government agencies. This bill also incorporates outreach to states where appropriate, But the council's charged with coordinating on a wide range of issues relating to outdoor recreation, and that includes things like investments relating to outdoor recreation on federal lands, improving the accessibility of information related to recreation to the public, improving access, and identifying and engaging partners outside of the federal government. Another provision that I know is of interest to some is relates to rock climbing and fixed anchors. This is something that's been, particularly in wilderness, has been a matter of controversy over the last decade or so, maybe longer. But this act, the Explorer Act, tried to address that and now directs the Department of Agriculture and Department of the Interior to issue guidance for recreational climbing activities. And that guidance has to recognize those activities, specifically including the use, placement, and maintenance of fixed anchors as an appropriate use within wilderness, so long as it's undertaken in accordance with the Wilderness Act and the terms and any reasonable terms and conditions that the agency set on that use. So protects existing anchor systems, and so that was a important provision for members of the climbing community. And then finally, just Aaron asked me to address this one real quick, and I will address it just quickly. There is a savings provision at the very end of the bill that says that, and this is a quote from it, no additional federal funds are authorized to carry out the requirements of this act, and the activities authorized this act are subject to the availability of appropriations made in advance for such purposes. The effect of that is, and I alluded to the fact that there are some potentially resource intensive inventories, and so there's the act directs the agencies to do quite a bit. And so the savings provision essentially says that the funds need to be there in order for those things to happen. And they can come out of program funds, but as resources may be cut, that's something to just keep an eye on. I think that's all I have.
Yeah. That concludes our formal presentation. Thanks so much, John, and thanks so much, David. And David, if you want to pop your camera back open, that would be great. And we can chat a little bit. And Karen, if there's Q&A or some questions that have been posed that you want to try to put to us, that'd be super. And I'll just start off sort of this post presentation conversation by asking a little bit about implementation. You know, there's a couple provisions like the temporary permits provision that has a deadline on it of 180 days, right? There's other provisions like the exculpatory agreement provision that specifically has like a 2-year timeline. But timelines don't exist for implementation of all these. And I'm sure there's outfitters who'd like to take advantage of some provisions as soon as possible. So like, what do we anticipate in terms of, let's say, the Forest Service in particular, and how long it might take them to allow us to avail ourselves of some of these provisions, do you guys think?
You want to hit that one, David?
Yeah, you know, there was a question. I think the last point John made in his presentation raises an interesting point about whether or not if there's certain specific, whether they're going to say that, well, we're not going to implement these changes to the permitting things that they don't want to do because we don't have the money to do it. You know, because they're going to be some some of it's going to require rule changes or Federal Register notices, and that's one of the questions I had about the consequences of that provision. Now, that's not what it was intended for, obviously, but John, I just wondered about your opinion on that from a legal standpoint.
Yeah, I mean, it was really intended. There's an Anti-Deficiency Act that I think that was partially intended to address. But yeah, I think I think there are reasonable questions now. I mean, there's a lot for the agencies to unpack some of this. Some of it's over the long term. Some of these provisions, the agencies have 7 years to do it. Some of them they have 2. Some things are more immediate. So it's a good question that I don't know that we have the answer to it yet. But it's something we're going to need to keep an eye on and keep engaging with the agencies on, just to with regard to the timing of implementation, and to make sure that they're implementing it in a way that's actually helpful to the industry.
Yeah, so I kind of wondered if some of the provisions would still be legally binding, like the
Because
exculpatory
of
agreement provision.
because of the sunset provision is like does everything have to be determined to be allocatable or not? Yeah, I hope not.
I'm not concerned about some of that stuff. And just on the exculpatory provision, actually, one thing I just want to note, because I don't know that we talked about this, but and Aaron, I think you alluded to it, but that provision gives the agencies 2 years to review their policies on exculpatory agreements and revise their policies accordingly. Now the Park Service, as David and Aaron mentioned, jumped on that very quickly, and a month ago put out their new policy, changing their very longly held policy that only allowed visitor acknowledgements of risk and didn't allow liability waivers. So they moved on that quickly. Not sure that the Forest Service has moved quite as quickly.
No. Last I heard was they were going to try to implement a rule change in March, but a lot has changed since I heard that. So they have 2 years. But if I wanted to calculate my gross revenues, right, I would want to not include merchandise and souvenirs starting now, right? And I would feel like I don't think there was a clear policy in place that said they were supposed to count that. So do they need a clear policy to omit it? Yeah. I don't have an answer to that, but I know that certainly for some folks in the Forest Service, they're looking at that 2-year time frame for a liability waiver is a long wait.
Yep.
So that might be some of the inevitability of the process of implementing a really big recreation package too.
Guys, we do have 2 questions if we've got a couple minutes to answer.
Let's go for it.
This one comes from Pat. Does the way we computate gross receipts change, in particular, including donated trips in gross revenue?
That's a good question. And I think this comes from an effort on the part of the Forest Service to try to capture fees for trips that you would have charged for, but you ended up not charging for. And I think they think that's like fee money that's taken out of their pocket. Like there's nothing specific in the bill that addresses donations. It's specific to 3%. It's specific to that list that you saw, which I could pull up again, that was in David's presentation. But to my knowledge, I don't think there's anything in the bill that directs the Forest Service to consider donations differently. John, David, do you guys have a different opinion?
Yeah, no, I mean, there are 2 alternative definitions or kind of methodologies you can use to calculate adjusted gross receipts for the purpose of fee calculation, where we're using a percentage fee. But they don't address donated trips at all, but they do specifically address how you do those calculations.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, one of them, I can go through them just very quickly. If you got a minute. But one of them, and this is at the selection of the provider. So the first one is you take the cost of the trip, excluding amounts related to goods, souvenirs, merchandise, gear, and other additional food that the provider provides, prorated by the number of days of the trip occurring on federal lands covered by the permit. So say you have a 7-day trip, but only 5 of them are on the federal lands covered by the permit, then you do 5/7 of that cost with those exclusions. And then the second option, again, this is at the selection of the provider, which way you go. The second option is to take the total trip cost and then deduct any revenues from goods, souvenirs, merchandise, gear, and additional food provided or sold, any costs or revenues from services and activities provided off the lands covered under the permit, and other revenues from services provided on federal lands but not covered by the permit. So those are the two alternative calculations that are in the act.
Yeah, one thing I think that's important to note is that, we've had people who operated on who would do, say, a week-long trip, but would visit several different resources. And the Forest Service and sometimes BLM would be trying to charge on the full gross amount. Well, the way I read this definition, it allows you to deduct that portion of the revenue from those that would have applied to, those other resources you visited. Do you agree with that, John?
Yes.
Yeah, that's a big deal, the layering of fees.
Great. Couple more questions in regards to the photos. Tom says we have to pay 3% on photos sold on raft trips and Forest Service land. Would this eliminate the requirement to pay this fee?
So this is photos where they've got a photographer set up and they're taking the pictures and then they're like selling them at the conclusion of the trip, right?
So it sounds like.
That's it. I would think that the revenues generated would still be subject to 3%, but I don't think they'd have to get a permit to do the photography or videography.
I guess one question I have is whether that's part of the existing permit or not.
Right, if it's like in their permit.
Yeah, Tom, and if you want to elaborate on that, or feel free to raise your hand if you want to ask, because I don't have any of the details here, obviously.
There are folks, I think, in Idaho who have received communication from the Forest Service that disregards like that existing clause in their permit if it's in there.
They are required to have a separate permit.
They're required to have a separate permit for photography. It's on the Gila. That's interesting. I think a case could be made that permit could go away, but I don't want to give legal advice or make assumptions.
Maybe we should talk to Tom later specifically.
Yeah.
Okay. Andy's question, do the changes to the video and photography apply within the congressionally designated wilderness areas?
Right. So this is a question because within wilderness area, like commercial videography and filmography has traditionally been prohibited or hard to get a permit for. And I believe this is exactly what this is talking about. It doesn't make any jurisdictional distinctions. It applies to all federal lands, and it certainly seems to say to me that if you've got film and video resources that are taken on wilderness, that you would be okay to use those in your marketing materials.
Yeah, Aaron.
Yeah.
Can I chime in here?
Yeah.
So there's actually language in the film provisions that addresses the Wilderness Act, although it's not all that clear. But I'm not sure that's right because what it said, there's a section called or a paragraph called Wilderness Act clarification. And what it says is that no provision of this subsection is intended to or shall be construed to conflict with the provisions of the Wilderness Act.
So exactly the opposite of what I just said.
So there would probably be a minimum requirements analysis if somebody wanted to do filming in wilderness, and presuming they would even allow it to happen. I mean, people take pictures in wilderness all the time, but when you're doing commercial uses, it's going to be a different story for sure.
Right. And what Tom is saying here too with his question is that he's using PickThrive. So they're using the commercial system to sell photographs after the trips.
Right.
He says you could see it being rolled into the permit, but still paying the 3%. So maybe if we can help clarify that a little bit.
Yeah, we probably have a little bit. I have a little bit more education I could do on that provision of the bill. Work on it. Or what? I mean, we did keep an eye on it, but not like it wasn't the core of our work.
Right.
But I would say like one of the motivators I understand behind that is, content creators. So folks on YouTube and elsewhere who are don't know even how to get a permit to film on public lands.
In the interest of time, just so everyone is aware, we are at time on this webinar. I do have a couple more questions coming in. They are definitely coming from our members, so I'm happy to reach out to you guys directly and make sure we connect that way. But I do think we should wrap up. You guys
Okay.
okay with that?
Yeah. Let's definitely make sure we follow up with those questions. But that sounds great. And yeah, thank you. Thanks
Yeah.
everyone.
Thank you
for
everyone
participating.
for being here. John, Aaron, David, thank you so much for putting all this together and being here to present. Attendees, thank you so much for your membership and your participation, and we will get back to you all soon. Feel free to email us any other questions.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.